to help us collectively see how systems are or are not changing. We're part of an international learning community, evaluators, strategists, funders, and change makers who are all grappling with one core challenge. How do we understand what's actually contributing to change in complex dynamic systems? So this module is about building shared understanding of what causal pathways are, why they matter, and what it takes to be truly ready to explore them. And in many ways, today is our pause before the deeper dive. It's where we begin to challenge our assumptions, surface myths, and think more critically about how change really unfolds, not just in theory, but in practice. So what we explore today together will set the stage for the rigor and values we'll unpack in Module 2, and the design and implementation strategies we'll put to motion in Module 3. So let's begin by grounding ourselves in both the mindset and the muscles we'll need to make the most of this approach. So let's talk about who we are today. I'm Kimberlyn Butler, founder and chief possibility catalyst of the LEAD Agency, which is a social impact firm that partners with foundations and philanthropic organizations to design equity-centered strategies, evaluations, and learning experiences. Our work is rooted in systems thinking, participatory methods, and a deep belief in the power of community voice to drive lasting change. I've been engaged with the Causal Pathways Initiative as the philanthropic engagement lead, a role I first stepped into during our very first global symposium. And since then, I've had the pleasure of listening, facilitating, and helping build understanding and conversations just like this one we're having today. And so it's been an incredible honor and challenge to watch this movement grow, which includes all of you, of course. So thank you again for being here. I've also had the opportunity to apply causal pathways evaluation directly with foundations that are ready to move beyond traditional models to better understand how change really happens in complex systems and how to learn in partnership with those doing the work on the ground. And I'm especially excited to be joined by my colleague and co-conspirator in this work, Heather Britt, who brings deep expertise in evaluation design and learning strategy. And so now I'll turn it over to her to introduce herself. Heather?
Kimberlyn. I'm an independent evaluation and learning consultant, and I support teams and organizations to strengthen their capacity to plan, manage, conduct, and learn from monitoring and evaluation so that they can adapt and thrive in uncertain and dynamic situations. I've been an active member of the Causal Pathways Initiative since 2021, and I'm really excited to explore with you today the ways that causal pathway evaluations can add value to the important work that all of you all are doing. Okay, so we'd like to know who's in the room today. So Carolina, well, we didn't introduce Carolina, and that is a grave mistake. Carolina is really helping keep this thing moving along. And she is going to help right now by getting a poll started so that we can learn more about who you are. So we're asking 3 questions. What is your organization type? Foundation, nonprofit, or for-profit, or some other? What is your primary role in that organization? And what is your level of experience with causal pathways evaluation? And I just wanted to say that we're really all best served by having a lot of diversity in this room, because it takes a lot of different kinds of people playing a lot of different kinds of role to make causal pathways evaluation work and be meaningful and impactful. All right. Let's see, what have we got here? Okay, we've got a lot of evaluators in the room today. Great, welcome, but so glad also that we have program managers, program officers and managers, philanthropic leaders, nonprofit staff, and leaders. Okay, and some others. So, all right, wonderful. That's great to see. All right, the next question, that's the primary role. Let's see. Oh, the foundations. We've got foundation, nonprofits, for-profits, and other. Wow, that's interesting.
A lot of others.
Yeah, maybe you could pop into the chat what some of those others are. And also, by the way, this is just so that we can get a quick summary. We'd love it if you all introduce yourselves and where you're sitting and why you're here today in the chat. And Carolina will be monitoring that. Okay, so interesting there. And then describe your level of experience. So 44% are new to causal pathways evaluation. Welcome. Some, about a third have some experience, and great. We have one or two that we can turn to for some in-depth experience. Wonderful. All right. I'm going to turn it over. Thanks so much for that. I'm going to turn it over to Kimberlyn, who's going to give us a good overview of what we're doing today in our session.
Thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. Regardless of where you are, we're just so honored to have you here. So let's take a quick look at where we're headed today. Our focus is on building a shared understanding of causal pathways evaluation, which is why you're here, and getting more ready both individually and organizationally to do this important work. So that means we're going to look at surfacing some of the reasons this hasn't yet felt quite accessible or actionable in your context, and also identifying what it takes to help others move from curiosity to confidence. We're also really glad to have this time together because as we get started, we just want to, just get a quick notes to ground us in sort of this conversation today. So first, we want you to know this is a living training and you're a part of it, of course. So we're continually learning and improving it, and we genuinely welcome your feedback at the end of it. And in fact, we made a few tweaks based on previous insights from an AEA session that we did for this session so that we could give you our best. Secondly, we'll reserve time for Q&A at the end of the session, and you're welcome to drop questions into the chat as we go. Our colleague Carolina, who you just met, will help us monitor that. And you can also jot them down and bring them forward during the discussions that we have today. So if we can't get to everything live, we'll also try to follow up afterwards. So don't worry about if you just didn't think of something burning in this session. We're a network and we're here to support you. And lastly, all materials will be shared after the session. So there's no need to capture every detail you see, unless you're an auditory learner like me. You can stay focused on the conversation and the concept. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Heather.
Super, thanks. So we are going to do our very best to minimize the extremely technical language. And if we do use it, we'll try to explain it in plain language. And so trying to keep jargon to a minimum. We do want to point out that everyone, different organizations use different terminology for the way that we engage in the world to try to promote, influence, and catalyze change. Some people might use the term strategy. Other organizations use project or program, intervention, initiative. We're basically going to use those terms today interchangeably. Right. Thanks so much. Now we're going to get down to business and talk about how do we typically learn about change. So in the next slide, we have a summary. So you might be wondering, what do we mean by causal pathways evaluation? What is different or distinctive about it? So to get us started, it can be really helpful to compare causal pathways with what we're calling out here for today's purposes as a typical practice and what we're referring to as descriptive evaluation. So descriptive evaluation asks questions about what changes are happening, and they use a theory of change to decide what to measure. And the measurement, when conducting a descriptive evaluation, focuses on such issues as the intervention progress and implementation quality, outcomes, of course, and also a measurement of context and assumptions. I think one of the key points here is that during analysis and interpretation, the theory of change, again, plays another key role. So if the findings from the evaluation align with the theory of change, then we make conclusions that the theory of change is accurate and that the intervention is effective, right? If we see the kinds of outcomes that the theory of change predicts, then we say, oh, things are working. So we rely heavily on the theory of change to infer causal contribution. So what we're saying is distinctive about causal pathways evaluation is that instead of asking questions that just about what changes are happening, but we dig deeper and ask how and why those changes are happening. A causal pathways evaluation may use a theory of change, often do, but those evaluators and the evaluation design expects the intervention to evolve beyond the original theory of change and to contribute also to outcomes beyond those that we planned. So those are which we refer to as emergent outcomes. In other words, the theory of change does not tell the whole story. And so that when we go to conduct our evaluations and what we're looking to collect evidence is beyond a description of the intervention progress and implementation, although it will cover it, beyond the outcomes that we plan to look at emergent outcomes. Also, a really careful look at the context and what contextual factors may be contributing to those outcomes. And then, and here's the key part, right? Really diving into collecting evidence around how the change is happening. That is laying out well-evidenced pathways of change that link the intervention and or the contextual factors to the outcomes, right? And then when we get to analysis, rather than relying just on the theory of change, again, the evidence is the primary source that we rely on when we infer whether, how, and why the intervention and the context contributed to the outcomes, both planned and emergent. Okay, so that's what we're talking about today when we're talking about a causal pathways evaluation and what makes it distinctive. Kimberly, I'm turning over to Kimberly now, who has a really great metaphor to help all of this stick in your mind.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, this is one of my favorite slides because honestly, I didn't get it until I saw this slide, right? And so there is a space for, depending on where you come into this movement, there's a space for everyone, depending on your level of understanding. You're all welcome here. So this is one of my favorite slides. But, I want to walk us through this comparison because it's helpful to help shift our mindset and method that causal pathways evaluation sort of invites. So to build on what Heather just talked about, I want us to take a little bit of a visual step back and think about the difference between descriptive and causal evaluation in a slightly more intuitive way. So this slide captures a key distinction between descriptive and causal evaluation. So descriptive evaluations are like holding up a mirror. They reflect what's visible on the surface. You can see who was involved, what activities took place, and in some cases, what outcomes were observed. That reflection can be helpful, especially when we're trying to understand reach, scale, or immediate outputs. But as you know, mirrors don't always show us what's going on beneath the surface. They don't explain why something happened or what internal dynamics or conditions made change possible. So we're often left filling in the gaps with assumptions. And so causal analysis, on the other hand, is more like an X-ray. It takes a bit more time and intention to set it up. So it gives us a view of the internal structure, the underlying relationships, fractures, and forces that are either enabling or impeding change. And when causal inquiry is done well and done in partnership, it doesn't just diagnose, it empowers. So communities, funders, and practitioners aren't just standing in front of the mirror again, they're helping to make sense of the deeper story so we can make better decisions, align our strategies, support, and more meaningfully healing and transformation. So because ultimately in systems change, you can't fix what you can't see. And some of you may also remember the iceberg principle as well. I think a little bit about that. It's what's under the surface, right? The Titanic wouldn't have sank. So I think about that with systems and apply that to real challenges in the world. So before we dive in, to today's content, I want to also start by inviting you into a case that's very personal to me. It's a causal pathways journey I've been a part of and one that I continue to learn from today. So throughout this session, we'll return to it again and again to illustrate how the ideas we're discussing show up in practice. It's our anchor and a reminder that causal evaluation isn't just theoretical, it's practical, it's possible, and when done well, it's powerful. So as you listen, I encourage you to think about your own work, where you might want to better understand how and why change is happening. So keep that in mind as we move forward. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather to help us step into the story. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, great. So, Kimberlyn, I've really enjoyed preparing for this for today's session and digging into this case with Kimberlyn. So, I would like to ask you to get started by telling us a little bit about the project and the strategy and who commissioned the evaluation and why. I think that when you unpack this and we can take some of the concepts and see how they came into play in your case, it'll really help all of us move from theory and into practice. So get us started with telling us a little bit about the project and the strategy.
Thank you, Heather. Of course, happy to do that. So the case that I'm referencing today, it comes from a national foundation that had been investing in areas like early childhood development, workforce equity, and job readiness. So they were seeing strong performance metrics and actually had they have a very strong reputation for doing so. They were looking at families served, trainings delivered, but eventually began asking a deeper question. Are we really shifting the systems that are creating inequity in the first place? And that's how they came to us at the time. And so that question reframed everything. Rather than commissioning an evaluation to prove impact, they wanted to better understand how change was actually unfolding. And that included what strategies were working, under what conditions, and for whom. So they intentionally turned to causal pathways evaluation as a way to go a bit deeper, not just asking what happened, but exploring why, how, for whom, and in what context. And so that marked a shift from tracking outputs, which they were used to doing, to seeing systems level insight. And that's really at the heart of causal learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, tell us how you got involved in this evaluation.
Yeah, so in my role at the time, I often helped set the table for learning. And in this case, I had a strong, long-standing relationship with the foundation's vice president of learning and impact, one key board member, and the head of the foundation at different points in my career. And so that trust gave me the space to introduce the causal pathways approach, not as a technical fix for them, but as an invitation to think differently about how change really happens. So I began with one-on-one conversations, right? And then brought into the program team that eventually sort of facilitated some design sessions that included external partners and grantees. And so that intentional sequencing of our relationship and sort of like learning what they need, listening for needs, but also recognizing this movement could be beneficial to where they were at that point in their journey helped to build a genuine buy-in. And that ensured that the evaluation wasn't something done to people, but something co-created with them.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you're pulling this out. These relationships are really part of the what is really essential to the enabling environment for this whole case. So can you tell us who was the intended user for this evaluation?
Yeah, and so building off what you just said, I always say relationships move at the speed of trust. And so once we got the trust established, to your point, the primary users were the foundation's board and program team. And I should also, there's a nuance here. It's the entire board, but of course, like many boards and governance teams, it was a subset of the board that was kind of like a learning committee as part of the board that laddered up to the larger board. So that particular board of trustees needed credible, nuanced evidence to inform major strategy decisions for the entire foundation. So this was major, right? And not just about where to invest as a board and for the foundation, but they wanted to understand how to invest in ways that actually accelerated systems change, because this particular foundation has a national systems change team. And so the credibility of the process really mattered, but so did its usefulness. So this wasn't about compliance, it was really about learning. And so they really leaned into the learning like you're doing today. And because the foundation was committed to equity, as many foundations are today, we knew our methods had to elevate diverse perspectives and not flatten them. So that was essential to both the rigor and the integrity of the work.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
should note that trustee, I didn't mention this, Heather, as we were prepping, but I should note for everyone, identity matters. This was a board member who had an intersection of identities. So it really mattered that the foundation connected deeply with the community on the ground.
Yeah, so they were invested in those
That's right.
choices. Okay, so that's the impetus and the inspiration really for the evaluation. Can you unpack the specific evaluation questions that they were trying to answer?
Sure. Yeah, the core learning questions in this evaluation weren't about checking boxes. They were about surfacing the relationships and meaningfully understanding contribution in complex systems. So the questions were, how did change happen across these workforces? Why did it happen? What conditions or strategies enabled progress? Who benefited? And importantly, who was left out? What role did the foundation's investments play? And what else may have contributed to the outcomes we observed? These questions were designed to invite exploration, not just measurement, making space for complexity, emergence, and the lived realities of people closest to the work. We also intentionally left space for iteration. In culturally responsive and equity-centered evaluation, the questions aren't static. They evolve as new voices come into the room, as power dynamics shift, and as unexpected insights surface. So from the very beginning, we set the intention to co-create the questions with program staff, partners, and community voices. We wanted to reflect not just what the foundation needed to know, but what people on the ground cared about learning too.
So you've mentioned complexity and emergence, two of my favorite topics, and accounting for complexity, iteration, emergent outcomes. These are all distinguishing characteristics of a causal pathways evaluation, as we've mentioned. And so the evaluation design has to take that into account. So can you kind of unpack the methods and approaches that were selected and some of the reasoning about why those choices?
Absolutely. So to explore those big causal questions, Heather, why change was happening, we used two core methods designed specifically to address complexity and emergence. So ripple effect mapping allowed us to visualize the broader system of shifts that sparked different strategies, like dropping a pebble into the water and tracing the waves. And facilitated group sessions, grantees, community members, and even the employers came together to map what had changed. And they also wanted to know why it mattered and how it connected to the foundation's work. So it's a method built to capture both intended outcomes and the emergent ones, the unanticipated ripple effects that often signal deeper transformation. But of course, one method alone didn't work here. We added contribution analysis, which offered a structured way to explore the plausibility that the foundation strategies contributed to the observed changes, while also asking what other factors might have played a role. It wasn't about claiming attribution, it was about tracing contribution with humility and precision. So, what made these methods powerful is that they were participatory by design, and that's my favorite part of it. The insights didn't come from evaluators looking in from the outside. They were co-constructed with grantees, partners, and community members who lived the work. And so in systems change work, I want you all to remember that it's not just rigorous, right? It's responsible and equitable.
Okay, so I want to just stop and take a closer look at contribution analysis and the role that it played in the evaluation, because a theory of change is an essential part of a contribution analysis approach, and in causal pathways evaluations, we've underlined that we don't want to be bound by only that theory. So how did you balance that tension there for this evaluation?
Yes, tension and decisions. I think that's the name of like what you have to grapple with in this work. And so it's an important tension to name because in systems work, things rarely go according to a linear theory of change, as you probably all are aware. So we use contribution analysis precisely because it offers a structured way to test causal claims without assuming attribution. We started by mapping the foundation's theory of change, yes, but then we layered in real world evidence that emerged from the ripple effect mapping that I mentioned, including outcomes that weren't anticipated but were clearly meaningful. So that allowed us to treat the theory of change as a living document, not a rigid blueprint. Then we explored plausible links between the strategies the foundation supported, like employer convening, storytelling, and technical assistance, and the observed system shifts, changes in hiring policies, new equity focused discourse, and stronger cross sector collaboration. But we didn't stop there. In our sense making sessions, we asked participants, the grantees, partners, and residents, what else might have contributed to these changes? And so we looked at alternative explanations like economic trends, political shifts, or other initiatives in the field. This wasn't a check the box exercise. It was essential to being honest about complexity and also about power. When we made causal claims, we have to be able to say, like, what we know, why we think we know it, and who else helped us reach that conclusion.
Okay, I want to underline something important you just said about alternative explanations and why they're important. Outcomes are usually the result of both intervention and the context. So did the evaluation gather evidence on other contributing factors other than the foundation's strategy?
Yes, and this is an area that I often reflect on deeply. The evaluation team conducted a desk review, Heather, and a handful of interviews to surface some contextual factors. But most of the insights came through participatory sense making sessions. That process, bringing people together to collectively weigh different possible explanations, was powerful, actually. But still, if I had a chance to do it all over again with what I know now about causal pathways evaluations, um, I would build in more intentional data collection around context. So that could include stakeholder interviews, focus specifically on system dynamics or trend analysis to better understand external shifts and overlapping efforts. Because acknowledging context isn't just good evaluation practice, it's also a matter of equity. So it honors the fact that change is co produced by many actors under many conditions. And it helps us avoid overstating the role of institutional power and outcomes that were deeply collective. So, yes, alternative explanations do matter, and they deserve the same rigor and humility we apply to our own contributions.
Thanks for underscoring that point. Okay, so I think you have a sample pathway to share with us, so maybe you can walk us through it so that we can see what you mean. And I do want to just, I'm giving a shout out that we're running a little bit low on time. So if we can trim, we should think about that so that we have time for our small group.
So let me share one causal pathway that emerged from this evaluation. It's an example of how change moves through a system in non-linear layered ways. To begin with storytelling, the job seekers sharing their experiences of exclusion and opportunity with local employers and workforce leaders. Those authentic stories created urgency and public comments, or actually public commitments from employers and statements of their intent to change, which started to build pressure and external accountability. Those public commitments in turn led to internal shifts in HR policies, things like rethinking hiring criteria, adopting fair chance practices, and integrating equity goals into recruitment pipelines. At the same time, technical assistance and peer learning among nonprofit partners help spread and scale these shifts across a broader network of employers, creating the ripple effects far beyond the original engagement. But here's the key point. None of this happened in a straight line. No single action or strategy caused these changes. The evaluation revealed a web of reinforcing efforts, advocacy, relationship building, policy engagement, narrative change, all sort of working together over time to shift not just practice, but mindset. And that's the power of causal pathways evaluation. It doesn't flatten complexity, it helps us trace and honor it.
Yes, I love that point. Thanks for underscoring it. Okay, so what actually changed because of this evaluation? Did the foundation adjust the strategy based on the findings?
Yeah, the foundation didn't just adjust its grant making strategy, it actually reimagined how it learns. So, what began as a learning exercise for the board, as I mentioned earlier, and the national program team, quickly evolved into a broader cultural shift for the foundation. They started to build strategy with partners at the table, not just on their behalf, and they asked more generative questions. And then they began investing more deeply in long term systems change, not just program success, which they were historically known for. And the board used these findings to inform critical decisions about where and how to focus resources. And they gained a clearer understanding of what it really takes to move the needle on equity at a systems level. But perhaps most importantly, they became more comfortable with complexity, which we continuously mention here today. They were more curious about what they couldn't predict and more confident using non traditional methods to explore it.
Yeah, I really like this case for so many reasons. So tell me some of the reasons why it stands out for
Mhm.
you.
Yeah, what stands out most, Heather, for me in this case is that one, causal pathways evaluations don't require randomized control trials to be credible. Secondly, that participation enhances rigor, it doesn't dilute it. And then thirdly, sometimes the more powerful question isn't did it work? It's what contributed to change and how do we actually know that? So when we shift our questions, we begin to shift our possibilities. And in this case, it helped a major foundation move from tracking activities to truly understanding impact. And that's what makes causal pathways so powerful. It expands what's possible when we shift how we ask, learn, or act. And for me, what stands out most from studying and learning this evaluation is how much trust and openness to learning is really required for everyone involved. And as an equity focused evaluator, I want to mention that I came from a from the philanthropic sector, actually, with a practitioner lens. So I had to go deeper in my own practice, not just methodologically, but relationally. I had to be willing to hold space for the emergence, to follow complexity rather than simplify it. And I had to honor the perspectives of those closest to the change as legitimate sources of causal insight. And it reminds us that causal pathways work isn't just about technical tools, it's about cultivating the conditions where truth telling, co interpretation, and systems learning can actually happen. So, Heather, I'll turn it over to you.
All great reasons. And I'm
Yeah,
watching the chat pop up as
yeah,
other people are also echoing some of the important themes. So I can tell that it's
wonderful.
working for some other folks too.
That's great.
I want to just highlight a couple of the reasons why I find this case so helpful for distinguishing what makes a causal pathways evaluation and distinct from what we're calling a descriptive. So again, the foundation evaluation team looked beyond the theory of change. That's really important. They expected evolution, iteration, they expected adaptation, and they designed intentionally to capture that. And then I think also it's a case that demonstrates that many different kinds of people coming from different perspectives and playing different roles all need to work together to make this kind of evaluation effective and useful. And then your particular reflection on how looking back, that reminds us all that strengthening causal pathways evaluation in the field is a process, and we start where we are when we can, and then deepen our practice over time. Um, so yeah, those are some of the reasons why it stands out to me as being particularly a useful case. I learned a lot, and thanks for everybody for listening. Um, Now we're going to take a look at some of the things that are actually holding us back and making it difficult to do what was achieved in this case, what some of the myths are that about causal pathways evaluation and causal analysis. So moving on to the next section. Great, wonderful. What is holding us back? So in the next slide, we're going to unpack 4 types of myths that we've observed over time that get in the way of improving our practice of causal pathways analysis and evaluation. And we're going to address each one of these. And as we unpack these 4 different myths, I just want us all to remember that that we need lots of different kinds of people to make this work. And right now, some of the points that we're going to unpack in the myths are going to be more relevant to some of you than others. Some myths are relevant to a broad range of folks who have input into commissioning, managing, and using evaluation. And then a few of the myths are more specific to folks that are going to have decision-making input into evaluation designs. So those 2 myths are going to get a little technical. Bear with us. If you are, but we'll try to unpack it in plain language. And I just want to give a shout out that the Lost Causal article will be in the resources if you want to dig a little deeper. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kimberlyn. She's going to get us started with the first 2 myths.
All right. So one persistent myth is that causal designs are too extractive, especially in community-based settings. But when done thoughtfully, causal approaches can actually center community voice rather than marginalize it. So these methods don't have to rely on rigid surveys or abstract models. Tools like ripple effect mapping, like I mentioned earlier, participatory sense making, and narrative analysis draw directly from lived experience to explore how and why change is happening. Instead of extracting data from communities, these approaches invite communities into the meaning-making process, using visuals, dialogue, and storytelling to make complex systems more understandable and more actionable. So when evaluators create space for community learning and incorporate multiple ways of knowing, causal analysis becomes not just accessible, but empowering. Another myth is that causal designs are inherently rooted in white dominant frameworks or only serve top-down philanthropic goals. I actually heard that a lot when I was doing sort of my listening tour, engaging funders in this initiative. But causal analysis itself is not the problem. It's how and by whom it's actually practiced. So there's a long tradition of non-experimental causal methods, many developed by Indigenous scholars, participatory evaluators, and global communities that uplift multiple truths, not just single narratives. These approaches can interrogate dominant assumptions, test what we think we know, and surface community-defined pathways to change. In fact, when we use causal approaches with intention and humility, they can actually shift power, generating evidence that is more useful, more just, and more aligned with how change really happens in the world. So the truth is, causal analysis doesn't have to narrow what we see, it can expand it. It's a tool that, in the right hands, can support equity, deepen insight, and honor complexity. And so I'll move us on to this other myth that I hear, right? One of the most persistent myths about causal analysis that you hear also is that it's too burdensome for participants, especially in complex community-driven settings. So it's true that meaningful causal evaluation requires engagement. But let's also be clear, engaging those closest to the work isn't a burden, it's a strength. These are the people with the deepest insights into how change unfolded and why it mattered. The real issue isn't the time it takes, it's actually how the time is used. When participation is purposeful, respectful, and grounded in shared learning, it doesn't feel extractive. It feels affirming. It builds trust, surfaces new perspectives, and creates space for those often left out of the strategy conversations to meaningfully shape them. But we also need to rethink how we define burden. Too often, we only talk about the effort required when what we really need to talk about is the return. Evaluations that only describe what happened often fall short. They offer limited insight and little payoff for the people who contributed their stories and their time. But causal approaches, when done well, help us understand how change happened, why it happened, and what conditions made it possible. That's a kind of insight that communities can use. They could to improve, to advocate, to make more strategic decisions. And so in reflecting on my case that I mentioned earlier, um, you know, the case focused on workforce equity. We didn't just gather data from the partners, we invited them into the learning process. And so through participatory sense making, nonprofit leaders, community advocates, and even employers came together to map the ripple effects of their work. They named unexpected outcomes, challenged assumptions, and offered alternative explanations for the changes we were seeing. And many of them told us that the process itself was valuable, that it gave them the language, the clarity, and momentum to guide their next steps. And that's the goal. It's not just to collect insights, but to return it to them, right, in ways that inform, empower, and energize. So when done right, causal pathways work doesn't burden communities, it honors them. And it transforms evaluation from something extractive into something truly beautiful, equitable, useful, and generative. And finally, I want to lift up another myth that this common misconception that causal designs are only backward looking, that they're just about unpacking the past and don't have much to offer when it comes to making strategic decisions about the future. But in reality, understanding how and why change occurred is essential to refining and improving strategy, especially in complex systems. When causal analysis is done well, it helps organizations see three things: which efforts contributed most to the outcomes they care about, under what conditions those contributions held, and for whom the change was most meaningful or at least felt. That level of insight does more than explain what happened, it actually informs what to do next. It's very future focused. It allows organizations to challenge untested assumptions, spot leverage points, and identify more equitable and effective pathways forward.
Thanks, Kimberlyn. Yeah. So I'm going to unpack two myths that have to do specifically with the methods that we use. And the first one of those myth is that the evaluations that we're currently doing are already causal. There is nothing that needs to change. So this one's a little tricky because on the surface it sounds reasonable. Many evaluations do describe change, connect activities to outcomes, and make causal claims, right? But think back to the beginning of the session where we compared descriptive evaluations with causal evaluations. Descriptive evaluations observe outcomes and use the program theory of change to explain how the strategy contributed to those outcomes. And so often causal claims tend to be inferred, or we use rather weak evidence to support them rather than testing them rigorously with evidence. And so that means that the evaluation relies primarily on logic and reasoning rather than evidence. So just because an evaluation measures outcomes doesn't mean that it has applied a rigorous causal lens. And so I think that it's been clear, especially through the case and what Kimberlyn has been saying, that if we stop at description and reasoning, we may risk reinforcing the very assumptions that we are intending to examine. So with causal pathways evaluation, we dig deeper, we make assumptions explicit, we consider alternative explanations, and we test them with evidence. So how do we do that? What methods can evaluations use to examine causality more closely? So when we get to unpacking that, we run into a few myths there too. Okay. So on the next slide, there we go. When we start to talk about rigorous examination of causality, one of the first issues that comes up is the idea that randomized controlled trials, RCTs, or quasi-experiments are the only ways that we can test cause and effect relationships, right? And so for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about the decisions that an evaluator makes in crafting strong designs, and I'm going to use some of the specialized language that evaluators use. If you're not an evaluator, don't worry. I'm going to make sure to explain these terms and why, even if you're not directly involved in these decisions. A basic understanding is relevant to the work that you do around programming. And if you are an evaluator, I'm going to make a few generalizations and simplifications in this session in order to make the main point. So I beg your forgiveness. There are two main families of methods that we can talk about when it comes to exploring causal relationships. They go beyond being just different groups of methods. They actually represent different perspectives on how the world works and how to influence change. So RCTs and quasi-experiments are in what we're calling today the counterfactual family. In this family of approaches, causal relationships are generally conceived of in a linear, one-directional way. Because of A, B happens, or because of A, B, and C, D happens. To uncover these causal relationships using RCTs or quasi-experimental methods, two important things must take place. The interventions must be conducted with fidelity. And what that means is that the key elements of the strategy or project or intervention must be clearly defined. They must be implemented in a uniform manner and not be changed or adapted during the implementation, right? At the same time, the evaluation must also measure a counterfactual or an alternative version of the program, or no program at all. You can think of that as like roughly equivalent to a placebo in a medical kind of trial. And program participants must be assigned randomly to either the program or the counterfactual. And often a high number of volume of cases are required to have to get data that you feel credible. So as a program person, you can realize that it's not always feasible or ethical to operate your programs in such a manner. And so that's one of the reasons why RCTs and quasi-experiments are not appropriate in all cases, right? All right, so causal pathways evaluation methods are and sit in another family of methods that we're calling the generative family. These approaches assume that there are many different causal factors. A may only lead to B when preceded by C and D, and F is also present, and there may be a number of causes and effects, some outside the control of the intervention and some within it. So that means causal relationships are basically complicated, many factors of varying weight and placement in the causal pathway. But there's also the possibility of feedback loops. And generative approaches go even further. They recognize complexity, which means that the causal relationships cannot be predicted, right? And that there is also more than one understanding about how and why, under what conditions change happens. Perspectives matter. This is all basically systems thinking concepts are part of the way that we, the generative family of approaches thinks about the world and the way to make change in it. So to uncover causal relationships using generative approaches, you also seek to understand rival explanations, but not in the same way as we do with counterfactuals. We've talked about some of the ways that you can begin to examine rival explanations. We've touched on them. High quality causal analysis outlines the pathways of change, triangulates data from multiple sources to examine specific links in a causal chain, interprets evidence collaboratively with people, any number of these things. Even if you're not an evaluator, I hope it's clear that generative approaches and counterfactual approaches represent different views of how change in the world happens, okay? And so I'm going to now unpack some of the methods that are out there by which we can examine from the generative family. Carolina, can we have the next slide, please? There we go. Wonderful. So there are the final myth is that there are no rigorous non-experimental designs for examining causality. Here on the slide, we have a summary of just a few of the different options that are a good starting point for strategy, for looking at causality for interventions and strategies that embrace adaptation and emergence, right? So the evaluation that Kimberlyn described used a combination of contribution analysis and ripple effect mapping. On this slide, we've kind of subdivided the different kinds of approaches that we're lifting up for consideration. We've subdivided them into 3 different ways. So there's the theory-based. I did see a question in the chat about theory-based. So there are theory-based approaches, and we have 6 illustrative examples here. Contribution analysis is one of them. We have participatory approaches with 5 examples. We've got, so a lot of them are often narrative approaches, so they overlap with storytelling there. And then 3 methods that are considered systems-based or out of the systems thinking world. So these methods are all good starting points when designing an evaluation to explore causal relationships that are either complicated or complex. Keep in mind that each method has strengths and weaknesses, and it can be helpful to combine 2 or more approaches. So one method may be able to address the weaknesses of another, and so much the way that ripple effect mapping was combined with contribution analysis. We really recommend that you work with an expert evaluator to help make design decisions. They can be quite nuanced judgments. And to keep in mind that using a method like this, using this method alone is not going to ensure that you have a high quality causal pathway evaluation. But it's a great starting point. And then you can lean in and add techniques that we have unpacked, like triangulation, making sure to do a good job of examining alternative explanations. These techniques you can lean in and invest in and strengthen in any of these approaches. All right, I've stated a very surface level for this, and that's because in sessions 2 and 3, you will have the opportunity to really dig into some of these issues further. All right. I'm going to try to do this slide very quickly because we are, of course, running over time, as one does. All right, the first point is, and the key takeaways is we are already good at thinking causally. Now we are asking us all as a field to increase our capacity to do causal analysis, to understand whether and how the hypotheses we make in our theories of change and our strategies hold up in the real world. Kimberlyn and I both have really stressed that we think that the investment is really worth it. Making causality visible creates opportunities for our programs and our interventions to be more adaptive, effective, and equitable. And we hope we've given you a sense that there is a growing suite of robust non-experimental methods. Good options are out there for doing good causal pathways evaluation work. And it's an exciting time actually to get involved in that. And lastly is that it's really important that rigor and participation aren't trade-offs. They are mutually reinforcing aspects of causal pathways and evaluation. When the people who are with lived experience, by those affected by the strategies and programs, are involved deeply in evaluation, not just as respondents, but involved in as deeply as you can take it in naming, interpreting causal relationships and the findings and what they mean, then the evaluation approaches are strengthened. Thank you so much for your patience while I rushed through that. This now brings us to a poll. in which we're going to ask you to reflect on your own situation and think about, of the myths that we unpacked, which of those are impacting the work that you are doing? And give us rank. Let's see. I'm supposed to give my answer too. It's funny, or else it doesn't close. All right. So I did my vote. I hope you did too. We're going to take a quick look at the poll results before we go to a small group discussion. And great. Carolina, do we have some poll results? Oh, wow. Okay, this is interesting. Myths about the methods is the top myth with 37%. That's really interesting. Followed by myths about who can participate and who benefits. Oh, that's that thing about burdens. Really,
That was
really
my vote.
interesting. Was it? Was it? Okay,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah, I had to vote. That was to be.
My vote was really around about whether we're already using it or not. But of course, I went back and forth between that and method. So I totally get that. I think it probably has a lot to do with where you're sitting and what your relationship is to conducting to evaluations, what kind of role that you play in the whole evaluation process. So this is really super interesting to see. Thanks. Oh, and we have a 9% on the other. So that's interesting. Maybe we can hear about that. Maybe you can talk about that in your small groups. Okay, over to you, Kimberlyn, to get us started on our small group discussions.
Excellent. And the chat is popping. You all keep making that happen. It's an active conversation, and we appreciate that. So now we're going to move into our first small group breakout. You'll have about 10 minutes to connect with one another and briefly explore the questions on the screen. So what myths or assumptions do we currently hold in our organization about whether and how we should explore causality? We've listed a few common types of myths to help spark conversation. Myths about who participates, who benefits, whether causal analysis is actually useful, whether we're already doing this work, even if we're not calling it causal, and myths about the methods themselves, like what counts as rigorous or credible. There's no need to get deep in your breakouts just yet. This is a chance to really meet your group and get warmed up, and also begin surfacing some shared beliefs that might be holding us back. So we'll give you about a minute warning before bringing you back to the group, but off to the races. Enjoy your conversations. We'll see you soon.
And a quick reminder, this is a 10-minute thing. Is that right, Carolina?
Yeah.
I think we're 10 minutes. Wonderful. Okay, great.
Awesome.
Okay. Carolina, do we have everyone back now? From the breakout groups?
Yes, we should.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes. We just have a few minutes for debrief. And then we're going to take a 5-minute break for all of you resilient people that are going to continue with us into the second part of the session. So it would be great if I could get 3 people or 3 groups to share something, a 1 or 2 sentence aha moment, key point, agreement, contradiction that you all, something important that came out of your discussion. And others, I just invite everyone to put some of your feedback into the chat, and we'll just take the first 3 so that everyone can get up and stretch their legs for a few minutes. Who wants to go first? Just come off mute and give me a 2-sentence summary of your interesting discussion. Anybody who said maybe we could take each of the myths, and someone who had something about who discussed or had an insight about the first myth, myths about who can participate and who benefits. Oh, great. Rachel.
Okay, let me come on video and audio. I'm here. Yes, I had a great conversation with a colleague, and she was telling me about how the myth that was most challenging for her, she's a commissioner of evaluations, is um, that is the idea of kind of what is the level of effort for the benefit. Um, and talking with other people in the organization and trying to convince them that doing evaluations in a different way, even though it required more effort, would allow for greater benefit in many different ways.
That's great. That's a great example. And it's really great that folks who are commissioning evaluations, it's important to see that they have a role to steward the assets that they have, that they're making a decision of, and to do that really responsibly. So this is something that weighs on them. Thank you for sharing that. What about a group that talked about the myth about whether causal designs are useful? Basically, something that might convince that um, commissioner when they're trying to make a really good decision about how to use resources. Did someone have a great insight or pithy statement about whether causal designs are useful? And I cannot see your hand, so just go ahead and come off mute if you're like to. Oh, Allison, hi. Wonderful. Tell us.
Hi, I might be expanding the boundary of that myth for our conversation, but I'm gonna offer it, Heather. So I spoke with Connor, and we both had quite different positions in doing commissioning, but neither of us had either commissioned or done a causal pathway evaluation. But we're both hearing, given the shifting world and funding landscape and paradigms, um, hearing lots of questions about impact, and we need to like prove what we're doing works, which obviously we take issue with that question and that motivation. But perhaps this is a moment of opportunity to think about alternative ways to measure impact and explore it. Given the situation that we're in now. So we didn't get into the details of design, but thinking about this as an opportunity to encourage people to yes, ask those questions, and maybe think about alternative ways of approaching them.
Thank you so much for tying, Connor and Allison, for tying this discussion into what's happening now and the big changes that our field is experiencing. And yes, the opportunity to have impact on the conversations, to have influence on the conversations about impact. I think it's a really important moment to go back to who can participate and who benefit, especially. I'll just make a plug for it here at a time where also local leadership is really being lifted up at this key point too. So thank you so much. Okay, who has had a conversation about myths about whether or not we're already using it? Did that come up? People, especially, around distinguishing between descriptive, what we were calling descriptive evaluations and causal pathways evaluation. Did anyone have some good points to share about that?
I can say something. Sorry, I can't get on video right now, but my name is Saumya Alba. I work with JSI, and Heather, you worked with us a little bit on the momentum projects when we're doing stuff on
Hi.
complexity aware monitoring.
Yeah,
So
great.
yeah, great too. I may go a little bit beyond that and touch a little bit into the second one, the last question as well. I think we're already, I work for an organization that also implements programs and assesses. So sometimes during the process, we are already asking some of these questions, but some of these methods give a structured way of gathering information that's needed. Like with ripple effects, it's a facilitated discussion that probes in certain ways to get answers. I guess you could get some of that information in other ways as well, but it kind of gives you a structured process to follow to be most effective and make it participatory and people to get involved and bring in insights that may not come in a one-on-one discussion in some ways. I did want to touch a little bit on the last one as well. I think our sense also in the document that we put together is there are many methods that address causality in different ways, they all don't have to be super hard. So it's a question of how much you want to dig into it, how much you don't. Sometimes you want to do it at the very end. Some methods are appropriate, some methods are appropriate a little bit earlier. And you can decide how intensive the process needs to be. Over.
I think that's a great point. And I would also like to, in light of that, I would also like to suggest that sometimes scoping is an important consideration here. We should, I think there's a fallacy that every evaluation has to cover an entire program. You know, maybe what we do is we focus on some areas where our information is lacking, and we really narrow the scope of the evaluation, but we do a better job at unpacking the causal pathways and going for the evidence there. So this is one particular way I think that we can use our resources wisely. Okay. I am going to ask, so we are over time, but I still think that it's fair to give folks a few minutes just to stand up, stretch their legs. And then come back together again. And thank you for putting your good points into the chat while we do that. Okay, can we see folks back? Can I trim 2 minutes off? Could I ask people to be back in 3 minutes? Would that be okay? Instead of 6:18, that's Central European time. 6:18 would be 6:21. What in your time zone? Add 3 minutes. Can you do that? Would that be fair? Thanks, everybody.
Okay, are we back? Heather, are you there? Can everyone hear me?
I'm here.
Okay. All right, we're ready to move on?
I think so. Let's go for it.
Okay. Next slide, please. All right, so convincing initiative or program teams of the value of exploring causal pathways often starts with something bigger. That's why you see this big mountain here in this picture, helping them see the value of learning itself and how evaluation can support that learning in a meaningful, not burdensome way. Now, that's a broader challenge in our field, though. But in my experience, teams working in complex systems are already asking deep questions about how change actually happens. There's usually a natural curiosity we can tap into. So from the start, most teams are making hypotheses, whether explicitly or not, about how change will unfold. And once implementation is underway, they start to see what's working, what's not, and they have evolving assumptions and observations that deserve attention. So instead of starting with evaluation methods or jargon, I often begin with a simple invitation. When it comes to the changes you're trying to create, what are you most curious about? And that question, it kind of shifts the energy. It opens the door to conversation and often leads naturally to exploring causal pathways together. But we can't get there without trust. Remember, I mentioned at the top of the conversation that relationships move at the speed of trust, and that's true here as well. And so trust builds when we as evaluators understand the context, honor the work, and show up not just as technical experts, but as learning partners, or what some call critical friends. And that's the role we get to play, not to judge, but to walk alongside teams as they figure out what's really driving change. And so in the next slide, I want to start, us to sort of think about the opportunities to actually encourage causal pathways exploration. So if initiative teams haven't seen real value from past evaluations or learning processes, we may need to take a different approach, one that meets them where they are. Rather than trying to introduce something entirely new, we can look for moments when teams are already reflecting or asking questions, whether formally or informally. So here are a few entry points that are natural. One, strategy meetings, right? When teams are shaping or revisiting their approach. And we know foundations and organizations tend to have a lot of strategy refreshes. So that's a perfect opportunity. Grantee check-ins are also good when they're noticing what's shifting or what's not. And then finally, routine monitoring activities where data might spark curiosity or raise new questions. These are great openings to ask. You might ask, what are you noticing? What are you wondering about? What might be contributing to the change or the lack of it? So that kind of curiosity is often the door to exploring causal pathways. And so building on this in the next slide, once we found those natural openings in the next slide, strategy meetings, grantee check-ins, or monitoring activities, we can start to listen to the kinds of questions people are already asking. Often they're not just using the language of causal pathways. In fact, you never hear that, right? This is a newer movement, but the curiosity is already there. So they're wondering things like, what would it take to make progress toward this outcome? How will we know if it's working? What has this change come about? Or how has this change come about, I should say? What contributed to it? How do we know it? These are all questions that open the door to exploring causal relationships, and they can become really powerful entry points for a deeper learning conversation. But the key is, folks, that we don't have to lead with evaluation frameworks or technical methods. I love what the person mentioned about this doesn't have to be as complicated, right? We can start with the questions that matter to them, and then we build from there.
Thanks, Kimberlyn. We need lighter touch ways to begin to answer causal questions. We need to have like a menu of options for evaluation commissioners. And I'm thinking about the commissioner that from the small group discussion and that Rachel was talking about weighing their resources and the best way to spend them. So we need to be able to offer folks ways to maximize quality and rigor within real world time and resource constraints. And so what's really important here is to move in the right direction of deepening causal exploration and analysis as we can, and acknowledging when we have remaining limitations, biases, or gaps in the quantity or the quality of data. So two approaches that might be suitable to begin a journey of causal pathways exploration. I think Kimberlyn already mentioned some of these opportunities for reflection. And one very structured way of doing reflection and review that is used pretty commonly is after action reviews. A lot of people are familiar with them and then use them, and we can actually take them and tweak them and to include causal questions. So instead of just asking what happened, but to dig down into how did the change happen or not happen, and for whom and under what conditions and what difference did it make. So and we can also increase the credibility and the rigor a little bit by inviting a critical friend to join an after action review as a way to triangulate data from staff or partners and increase the credibility of findings. So a critical friend is somebody that is familiar with the situation, but yet has some sort of independence as well. So diverse perspectives basically in our after action reviews. We've also talked about storytelling approaches and narrative approaches. These are often a good entryway because people are already, lean into storytelling and do that kind of naturally and find it not as burdensome or intimidating or too technical. So we can just kind of be more intentional about asking causal kinds of questions and getting people to tell those causal stories with a little bit more detail and more intention. So, and in both of these cases, we can triangulate the data that we get from after action reviews or narrative approaches through desk review, relevant documentation. Someone could, the evaluation team might add that to the whole approach. So it's just remembering that there are places this is the start. These are some findings and places that we can start, and that we can then deepen our inquiry as the opportunities and our commitment to this causal pathways evaluation increases. All right. In the next slide, we're going to talk about just a couple of other ways to encourage teams to engage in causal pathways exploration is to, again, we've stressed this in a number of ways today, is to be sure to include engagement with those closest to the work, the people with lived experience, those whose lives are impacted. And engage them in the causal, asking the causal questions, doing the causal analysis. And those folks are often already asking those kinds of questions anyway, so leverage their participation. And this one, shout out to the evaluators. Often we need to let go of the language of causal pathways evaluation and listen in and use the language that is people are more comfortable with, right? And moving away from that technical evaluation speak and get creative, use stories, metaphors, use art, visual, use music, engage people visually and emotionally in ways that resonate with their culture and, make it fun and something they want to take part in. All right, so those are some ways that we're thinking about just getting you started and getting more people involved and excited about causal pathways evaluation. We're now going to talk about getting increasing our readiness, right? So, and the next slide is our visual attempt to kind of bring all the elements that we've been talking about today into one image that we hope will stick with you if you're a visual learner, and to say that it's really about how all of these things work together. So where there is where an organization or a team is, you can recognize the readiness when you have a clear use case and that there is buy-in from key folks of many different roles and different positions and different perspectives, are excited and see the value of asking the why and the how. And that also another time when it's a good opportunity is when there's a lot to learn, like there is the prior evidence around telling the causal story is limited. And we have some sort of the people that are invested in learning the answer to this question there's a way to bring them together and make the learning more intentional. And then at the bottom there, we get into the technical part, right? We're asking we're asking the questions, the how and the why, the for whom and the what context. We're also looking beyond our own vision, our theory of change. We're willing to look out into the context. We're willing to capture emergent outcomes. We're willing to really step outside our exact way of seeing the world, which is what a theory of change is. And we're willing to actually gather evidence around it and bring that to the table and talk about it with other people. I'm going to give a shout out to an article that will be in the resources. If you want to dig deeper into this particular discussion around readiness, look for Julia Lin and Marina Akbar's chapter on exploring causal pathways amid complexity. So next slide, please, Carolina. This is the same thing I just said for folks that like it written out, right? So we're just trying to really leave you with a summary about like, what does it mean to pull it all together and say, hey, this is a great situation for actually deepening our causal pathways exploration and commitment. All right. Because I want to leave some time for Q&A, we're going to move into, yes, a poll. One more poll for you all, and then we'll go into, again, a small group discussion. So the poll is, as you reflect on your own situation and strengthening causal pathways where you live and work, what do you see as the main challenge? Is it building buy-in with the decision makers, Or is it getting all those pieces to work together in order to really strengthen evaluation practice and move from descriptive evaluation to causal explanation? Let's see. Great. And as soon as we see the results of this poll, oh, wow, it's very close. That should make for a really interesting discussion. The readiness with evaluation practice part just leads only slightly from the building buy-in with decision makers. So that means we're close to half and half. And I'm gonna now just turn it over to Kimberlyn, who will set us up for small group discussion.
Okay, I had a little bit of a snafu, so I'm just coming back here. I was kicked out of the Zoom meeting. So where are we? I just got back.
Oh, Kimberlyn, we just did the poll on whether or not folks in their situation, their main challenge is either buy-in or strengthening the evaluation practice. And it was very close to half and half.
It was very close. Oh, wonderful. Okay, that's great. Okay. So that should be a great discussion. That totally makes sense.
Yes,
so
exactly.
We're gonna take a minute and allow you to reflect on your own context. So we've launched the poll, and so now we're gonna send you to your second breakout group. So you'll have another 10 to 15 minutes, I'm guessing 10 minutes again, to connect and talk through one of the core challenges we explored. And since you guys are split down the middle, you can choose whichever feels most relevant for your work right now. So if you're focusing on buy-in, consider what approaches seem promising in your situation, who might be a key ally or influencer to help build support. And if you're focusing on readiness, think about how might you help an initiative team begin or deepen exploration of causal pathways, and what causal questions might naturally surface as they explore their ideas. This is a chance to reflect, swap ideas, and learn from each other. So we'll give you some time to check as we near the end, and then bring everyone back for a brief share out.
Right, I can't. All right, is everybody back? Carolina?
Yes.
Is everyone? Oh, wonderful. Okay, so friends, colleagues, co-conspirators, co-facilitators, it's human nature. We always try to cram too much into one of these sessions. So we made a couple of decisions in order to how best to use the remaining precious time that we have together. We would love to hear anything you all have to share in the chat would be great. But if two people could come off mute, we'd love to hear an insight, an inspiration, a provocative question from a group that discussed buy-in, and then we'd love to hear the same pithy remark on readiness. And just go ahead and take yourself off mute and share. Anyone have any exciting inspiration around the challenges of buy-in and how we can get it?
Hi, it's Catherine Liakos here from the Caribbean Development Bank. I work in the evaluation office there. We had just the two of us in our group for the most part, and then a few joined at the end, so we didn't manage to get a wider discussion. But we also didn't know which topic we were supposed to be focusing on, but we ended up talking a bit about a buy-in more, I think. But also I see, looking at these two side by side, that they do actually very much link together, I would say. So in order to be ready, you have to assume there's buy-in. And the organizational learning culture is heavily sort of influencing how ready the receivers might be in terms of what methodology and approach they would like to sort of see or even if they're that interested in the methodology and approach, or want to jump straight to some conclusions.
So did you have a pithy remark or insight on buy-in or something on readiness?
I think one of the things was talking about mostly, the learning culture, budget costs, and timelines constrictions as well were some of the things that came up in our discussion. If Joy's online, she might want to say something else.
Yeah,
Those
hi.
are
Thank you, Catherine. I just was going to try to be as pithy as possible. The thing that I think is in terms of both readiness and buy-in of any sort is kind of the imagination of thinking about causality and thinking about like why is this happening and how is this happening versus the kind of top priority that we have to show someone that it's happening.
Okay, so more space for the imagination, and that budgets and timelines are hard on the imagination. A true and pithy statement. I appreciate that. Thank you. Does one other group just have we want to give some time for you all to do one more little internal reflection exercise. So if I could just have um, a pithy comment, insight, or provocative question about readiness.
I saw Anne Marie had their hand up.
Oh, great.
Well, yeah, I think one of the main takeaway in our group, for me at least, was tiny experiments that might work both for buy-in and for readiness. Like start small, propose, take one tiny indicator from one specific intervention and do a sort of experiment with it in order to show value for buy-in, and second, raise the level of literacy of your team colleagues, or around the method that might work with limited resources, investments, and so on. Do you think house is?
I really love it. You have actually shown how this thing about readiness and buy-in are mutually reinforcing. So tiny experiments. This is a brilliant takeaway. Find the little places that you can actually deepen the causality experience and increase buy-in, because people say, oh, it's possible. We can do it. I love it. Trojan mice. That's fantastic. Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm sorry that this is probably the juiciest part and we had to rush right through it, but Kimberlyn had such a great idea for a closing exercise and reflection that I do not want you all to miss this. So we're going to skip straight ahead to, yes, this slide. Kimberlyn, take it away.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for just hanging in there and being resilient. I know we lost quite a bit of folks, but you're still committed and we really appreciate it. So before we close, we want to invite a brief moment of reflection to help anchor today's learning in your own work, actually. So think about everything we've covered, from the core concepts at the beginning and the myths along the way we unpacked, to the case we discussed that was personal to me, and yourselves, right? And the readiness questions we just explored. Now take a moment to consider, what's one myth you're ready to challenge in your own current practice? So just think about one myth you're ready to challenge in your practice, or one shift you're inspired to make in how you approach evaluation or strategy. So feel free to drop this in the chat or note it privately if you like to journal. It's your personal takeaway as we move forward. So appreciate you leaning into that, because we want it to be actionable insights and not just a webinar and a session.
So we want to give people just one more minute on this commitments part, especially after these great pithy ideas coming out of the debrief and some other good ones in the chat. And then we have 1 more minute. We're going to introduce the resources that we have available to take this forward. And right before you step out the door, Carolina will have a quick survey so that you can help us just keep improving.
It's nice. I see a few great things in the chat. For those of you who are more introspective, thank you for just thinking about it. And I hope I heard some folks, everyone's here for different reasons. And I hope that you sort of saw yourself in me, right, who was unfamiliar. And then Heather is way more advanced in causal pathways than I am, right? So there's room for everyone here, right? No matter where you find yourself in the strategy, in these conversations, and helping folks check assumptions about how change happens. And if only our leaders today would think this way. That would be fantastic. The world would be a better place.
There's always someone who is in front of and ahead of us on the path.
Right.
Thank goodness for that. All right, I agree with that. All right, so thanks folks for taking this moment and for sharing some of your inspirations with us. I think also we're gonna, yes, Kimberlyn has gonna unpack for us some of the great resources that we have to accompany you on the journey.
So we know, thank you, Heather. So we know that today's session is just the beginning and many of you want to go deeper. And so the Causal Pathways Initiative offers a range of resources to support you wherever you are along the journey, from building understanding, which was the focus today, and starting to put things into practice. So on the left, you'll see we offer presentations and trainings to help build awareness and will. You may have seen us present at AEA, or the American Evaluation Association conference, and we're available to join other events by request. We also offer a virtual one-on-one level training that can be customized for your team or your organization. And in the center, we've curated some resources to help understand, to build your understanding and action. So you can go to betterevaluation.com, which is a hub of a ton of resources, actually, just mull around in there. Then there's also a Clarissa case study, which is another valuable example, and supplemental materials to go into great depth about methods and processes used. And then if you're looking for guidance on how to get started, there's a how-to chapter that offers step-by-step support on planning causal pathways evaluation. And then finally, on the right, you'll see our commitment to learning and acting together. So the Causal Pathways Brain Trust is actually one of my favorite parts of the network. I haven't said that publicly, but it is a space where funders can actually work through tough, very challenging real-world challenges and questions, and they get to collaborate with field experts. And sometimes that includes you. You can be a field expert. Yes, you. Because none of us is in this work alone. And so finally, you can find everything at causalpathways.org. And if you have questions or want to connect, just reach out to Carolina, who is fantastic, at carolina@causalpathways.org. And we'd love to support you on your journey. So thank you, everyone. And Heather, I'll turn it over to you for last words.
Oh, I just want to say thank you to everyone who came, contributed to your attention and your thoughts, and we really appreciate it, and we hope to hear more from you all. I also heard people in the chat saying, hi, I'm a Causal Pathways Network member. So we're a big and global collective of folks doing this together. So it's really great when we see your names pop up on the screen. So it's great to spend some time together. Thank you so much, and we look forward to staying in touch. Bye-bye.